as well, you know, we talk about this in terms of the length of time. It's been a number of years now that Alberta has been facing this difficult situation. And, you know, I think that for a lot of citizens, at some point you can't keep going any further. And even though in Canada's situation might have been, you know, a company-specific story, you know, if it was so attractive to continue to stay in Canada, I believe that they would have.
Yeah, fair game. But you're absolutely right. People in Alberta have a right to feel frustrated. They've been an engine of growth for Canada, both the national GDP, but also in creating jobs for tens of thousands of other Canadians. And all of a sudden, they're confounded and trying to get their oil to market. They're still lifting oil out of the ground. They're just not selling it for its appropriate price. And as a result, all Canada loses and Alberta loses big time. And we've talked about this before. As much as $30 billion a year is being sent literally in Brinks trucks down to the President of the United States from Canada. And it's a transfer of wealth we don't need. And so I understand that frustration acutely. It's resulting in job losses. It's resulting in increasing welfare rolls. It's serious.
It is serious. And when will we see any change? It's interesting to hear Victor Dodig last week comment about that this is time now where everybody kind of has to come together. And we got to figure this out for all of Canada. You, Chairman at TD Bank, how do we get to a consolidated Canadian solution as opposed to continuing to go down this path of job losses and companies leaving? I wonder if there's going to be more companies out of Alberta that leave. But how do we get everybody on the same side? How frustrated are you?
Yeah, well, very frustrated. I think he was spot on the money. The country does not have to be this divided. There is a balance that you can draw between respect for the environment and the fact that we are going to continue to produce resources. But we need to get the right economic rents for those resources, and we need to get them to markets. Certainly getting them to tidal water is imperative so that we get world prices, but we're also confounded in trying to get oil into the United States through other pipelines. Keystone XL is still being hung up in Nebraska and Montana. We're seeing Enbridge number 3 being hung up in Minnesota. At every turn, Alberta particularly is frustrated in trying to do what is in the national interest, and that is to create as much wealth for the country as possible. And at some point as Canadians, we have to stand up and understand Alberta's problem is our problem, and that we should all be on the same side.
So then what do you say to the leadership of Canada right now? That, of course, the Liberal minority government. What do you say to them?
Well, number one, on Trans Mountain, I think the die is cast. They've made a commitment. They bought the pipeline. 2,200 people have been hired in the last week or two. They're committed to building that pipeline. I believe they will build that pipeline. But I think they also have to change the rhetoric and show much more understanding about Alberta's situation and find other ways to give voice to Alberta's aspirations particularly. I know that Saskatchewan includes itself in that, but their problems are in many cases different, involving crop failure or difficulty of getting crops to market, or potash markets and so on, as well as their energy markets. So I think that the government of Canada has to understand these are legitimate grievances and frustrations, and take them seriously, listen attentively, and speak to the concerns.
But what's interesting about that is that for a number of years now, the Liberal government has said, we understand and we hear you, but we haven't seen the actual action, have we? Unless I'm wrong. So at what point do we all say, where's the action to prevent this from continuing? I mean, we understand that they understand, and we've heard that time and time again. But if TD Chairman at TD, former ambassador, if you don't do what you say you're going to do, you don't have the job.
Well, I think that's the view in Alberta. I think they don't think that action has followed the words. To be balanced here, a lot of the obstruction is coming from courts, who, in my view, candidly have overreached their mandates in many cases and continue to put obstacles and burdens and obstruct the will of the people as expressed through political leadership, duly elected leadership. So it's very frustrating. If you're in Alberta at that end, it's very frustrating. It's somewhat frustrating, I think, at the Government of Canada level as well, who believe they're doing the right things but aren't getting the results for it.
As a federal government, though, don't you need a stronger national policy of sorts for implementation?
Yeah, it's a tricky country to govern because there are constituencies in the country that have a very different view. On this one, I come down exactly where you seem to be coming from. I think we have to show national leadership. And if it means being unpopular in certain places, we have to be unpopular. We have to speak truth to power. Fact is, we are losing tens of billions of dollars of national wealth right now by our inability to deal with those problems in Western Canada. And I think this is one where we have to put some capital, take some capital out of the bank and put our popularity on the line to make sure the right decisions are made.
And I fear that people often don't understand what hurts them until they're in the situation, meaning you often don't recognize that maybe we have hallway hospitals until you're in the hospital. So these are billions of dollars that could go into education and youth and our hospitals that we're missing out on. Maybe it's not a big deal today, but 3 years down the road it could be very big.
I agree with Catherine's analysis, mostly because what she points out is when you're talking about something, there's a lot of debate and discussion that goes on, but really that's irrelevant. When people find themselves in a desperate situation, in a situation in which they need help and the resources are not there or not up to spec, you can really regret it, and you won't forget it when you experience it. I could tell you that hospital bed analogy, that's an excellent example, where you're sitting in the hallway and you need care. You can't imagine the desperation that some families feel when they handle something like that. And it's a precious moment that could mean the life and death for some people. That aside, I didn't want the video to get too long before I voice my opinion. Here's the problem that everybody faces. So Alberta's problem is our problem. I couldn't agree more. Canada relies on Alberta in so many ways that you can't even pin everything down. It's I wouldn't say the heart, but yes, the heart of our economy. Actually, I would say it. And feel free to dispute that, but that's how I feel. When you look at the amount of equalization that we've paid to the other provinces and the fact that we don't get that money back to ourselves in any way, it is truly a great expression of charity and love and fairness for the rest of the country that's not being returned. So you can look at it in this way. You can also look at it from the perspective of Frank McKenna, whom said that we... Actually, no, it wasn't Frank. It was Catherine Murray's idea that strong leadership is more important. And then Frank more or less agreed, yeah, even though we're going to be unpopular in some constituencies, we have to speak the truth. That's right. You think more about the great picture rather than a small, let's call it a macro view of things. Instead of, it means that their ideology and their fear tactics in government, that's getting away from the point, but it means that the government's philosophy, let's say, is not actually in the interest of the majority of its citizens. I could say it like that. The people are crying out for... the will of the people cries out. That's the truth. If you would merely open your eyes and you could see what you could see it pretty quickly what people are after. He talks about tens of billions of dollars of national wealth leaving the country and heading to the United States. So that's another failure and an incompetent one at that. But it's more than that. They both speak about the potential of that money actually helping Canadian people, which it would. It would, undoubtedly. If we're talking about at the height of the boom, the prosperity of Canada, the sky is the limit, really. If the oil sands and the energy sector were allowed to operate at full capacity, and we would be making so many billions of dollars for this country. And whether you admit it or not, or you're for it or not, as somebody that will stand against something like that, the prosperity of Alberta would be shared by the rest of Canada, no matter what. So, but as it stands now, it's very, very unfair. Again, Frank talks about the obstruction in court, spoken against the will of the people. So if you have any experience of that, of course, you would submit your intention to the courts. And as I understand it, even for a reasonable proposition, the courts are turning them down. Something that is the people's right to build and to conduct their businesses in a conscientious and responsible way, but they must obey the law, and we're all confined to the power of the law. And it seems that the law has been infiltrated in politics to run against the people, I could say. It's a deliberate ignorance of the necessity of fairness, let's say, because of this fake ideology that's existing in government. And I reiterate, the energy sector is the life's blood of this country. It is, whether they'll admit it or not. Technology created by oil, powered by oil, you name it. Everything that you see is a consequence of oil one way or another. And I feel very strongly that our way of life, our fundamental way of life, will be severely disrupted, not only financially, but in many other ways. If this kind of psychology in government continues. What I feel is that very strongly people need to open their eyes to how bad the situation is really getting. And it's good that Catherine pointed it out, because until you're in that situation of desperation, you're losing your house, you're losing your job, you can't make ends meet, you don't really know what that feels like. And it's a terrible situation to be in. It's a shameful, embarrassing, it can rip families apart, that kind of thing. It's a very real problem. And you can say it's only about energy, it's only about jobs, it's running contrary to the environment and so on and so forth. It doesn't matter. You're going to complain about the situation that we're in. Canada is the most accountable, the most responsible when it comes to the environment. We have the highest and best regulations in the world. And I believe that, because I know the nature of Canadian people. We love the environment. We want to be in harmony with nature, really. But we can't be any of those things unless we can afford to pay the bills, so to speak. So in that way, this government has gone way too far in ignoring the necessary, let's call them human rights of the people that they govern. So With that being said, I'd like to thank you for your time and attention, and goodbye.